Hello and welcome to episode 42 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my live streaming career as a radio presenter with one big regret: never getting to interview my hero, the legendary British musician Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul. Now, when I came up with this mad idea last year, I could not quite imagine the guests that I would be getting on this podcast. Be honest, I thought it'd probably be me in my bedroom rambling on about how much I love the music of Paul Weller. And I know there's a little bit of that, but hey, the guests make this thing completely. And none finer, surely, than rock and roll royalty, as Mick Talbot calls him, Rick Buckler, drummer for The Jam. Described as the big beat behind all of those great songs and the perfect drummer for the perfect band, Rick tells his story from the early days learning the instruments and meeting Paul, Steve Brookes, Bruce Foxton at Sheerwater School in Woking. And what you'll hear is a man really proud of the legacy and the music that endures to this day. So let's get into it. Hey, Rick.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm very well. Now, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited about this, and I know the fans listening will be as well.
Oh, good. Make a change, won't it?
Now, to kick off this story, we need to go right back to the very beginning, if that's all right. And I appreciate that this is quite a lot of time that's passed, so there may be things that you can't quite remember and stuff like that, but that's all right. I want to take you back to Sheerwater School, to the very early days, and to that formation of this band that we all know and love, and that has stood the test of time with these incredible songs and this music that you created together. When was it that you first started hanging out with Paul and with Steve Brookes, and this relationship started?
Really, it was because of there was a music teacher there called Avery, and he used to encourage people to meet up in the music room at lunchtimes. I think some people were there because they didn't have to go out into the playground, and some people were there because they were genuinely interested in music. There was a lot of album swapping and, sort of muso talk, if you like. There was a couple of guitarists. I think there's 2-3 other drummers. So it was a good sort of place for like minds to meet up and have a chat and what have you, just really for, during the lunch hour. And that's really where I met Paul and Steve. I mean, there were some good players. I mean, in those days, there was a lot of people who learned instruments and what have you. I mean, it's obviously, it's like one of those ways out of working class life is either football or music. So there was a lot of interesting stuff there in those days.
You mentioned album swapping, and this is a lovely thing. We've not talked about this on the podcast really at all. But the idea, albums were expensive, right? And as kids, it's not like you could kind of buy every single release that came out. So how did that work? So would you decide which album you were going to buy and which one your mate was going to buy, and then you swap between the two of you at times?
Yeah, usually somebody comes in and says, oh, I bought, the new Led Zeppelin one, or I've got Elton John or something like that, and you probably know nothing about them because it's a journey of discovery, obviously, in the very early days. So, when you're about sort of 14, 15, that sort of thing. And so you borrow them and you lend out because, like you say, albums were expensive. And so it was a good way of deciding who you liked, who you didn't like, without having to sort of commit to buying anything. Because, most of the radio at that time still focused on the charts and maybe some of the 60s music, because if you're talking about the early 70s and mid 70s, album music was unexplored really. So it was nice to sort of have that access to that by borrowing other people's albums that they bought in. And of course people wouldn't enthuse about the Moody Blues or whatever they've recently got into. So it was quite healthy in that respect.
How did you get into the drums? Because your school didn't even have a proper kit, did it? Didn't you have to make a set of drums? Is that right?
Yeah, obviously the school did not have a drum kit at all. They had very little in the way of musical instruments. They had a few tambourines and rubbish things lying about, but it wasn't. It was because the guy was a music teacher and he was, they had a rusty old piano and that sort of thing. I started a band with my twin brother and another friend of mine, and I really liked the drums because I don't know, there's something I like listening to the drums, and so I was sort of drawn towards that. But yeah, I had to make my own drum kit really to start with because I couldn't afford a brand new one, and they even today brand new drum kits are a lot more expensive than just going out and buying a guitar. There's a lot more stuff to get, so I couldn't make the bass drum, so I borrowed that from Guildford YMCA. There was one bass drum lying around doing absolutely nothing, so I thought, well, I'll borrow that. I don't think they got it back actually, but so that's how it started. And then I bought my kit sort of piecemeal. I went to the local music store and bought it bit by bit and built it up from there. And then eventually I had a proper drum kit, which was a Heyman.
And how are you learning to play the drums? Because it's not like you're watching videos on YouTube and finding these skills and these techniques. Is it just literally practice makes perfect?
There's a lot of that. No matter where you get your input from, whether even today, you still practice is always the best thing to do. I got an interest by just simply watching people on telly or going to shows and watching other drummers. I met a guy who was actually a very, very good jazz drummer, and I got quite a few pointers from him. It was not lessons as such, but, just things about, you should do this and keep your eye on that. And it was just pick it up as you went along. And obviously with drums, it's a lot of experimentation. This works, that doesn't work. How do you do this? The traditional way of playing, you can hear it. So you've got a fair idea about what you want to go for. So it is just a matter of, of getting into it and playing as much as you possibly can.
I guess there's a lot of kind of muscle memory as well, because it's hugely athletic playing the drums, isn't it? You need to be fit.
Yes, you do. Yeah. You have to stay up to speed most of the time. You can't sort of put it down and pick it up as easily probably as other instruments. But I think it's the same as with anything really. The more you play, the better you get. Nobody gets any worse. So, you just simply have to just keep going, really. I mean, I used to practice on the end of my bed, because if you practice on something that has no rebound, it's a lot harder. It's like boxers running in heavy boots, and then when they take the boots off, it's a lot easier for them, but they've actually built up all the muscles in their legs and stuff. So it's that sort of thing, really. And so, it was, I went through quite a lot of bed sheets that way, which used to annoy my mum. One corner had been this huge hole in some of the bed sheets, but couldn't have a drum kit at home, not to set up and play. I mean, it's like playing football in your living room. It's frowned upon, isn't it?
I mean, the other thing with drumming is it feels like, and certainly in the early days of when you were, gigging around Woking and then traveling up to London and stuff, with drumming, there's a lot of kit to carry around. It's, it's not like with a guitar, you can carry a guitar or a flute in a little case or even a keyboard. Man alive, with drums, that's a lot of stuff you're lugging about, isn't it? Oh, there
is, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the practical logistics of it, being able to fit it into a car is a trick in itself. Yeah, it's not a great instrument to learn in that respect. It's like you're the double bass player, the one who's got the great huge thing that you have to carry around all the time. So it does have its sort of fun side, shall we say, when it comes to sort of doing any shows. But, it just comes along with the territory. You just deal with that as you best you can, really.
Mm. And at which point in this does the jam form? Is it that you're roped in for a live gig? I mean, it's a bit like Ringo with Pete Best, wasn't it? There's another guy in the band already. Was it Bomber Harris? And you're brought in when he's away or something. Is that right?
Something like that. I mean, it was really that Paul and Steve had formed this sort of duo, two six-string guitar duo, and generally the thinking is that if you want to have a proper band, you've got to have a drummer. And so that was their priority. So, I mean, they used to do a few token things around, the workingmen's clubs and that sort of thing, and fairs and fetes around the Woking area as a duo. And if anything sort of more major came up, they would try and get Bomber Harris involved. I mean, in those days, it was all cover versions. It was all rock and roll 50s cover versions. I wouldn't say he was actually sort of, part of the band. They used to pull him in whenever they felt they had something worthwhile to do. He was more into jazz, I think. I remember there was a guy called Dave Stryker who used to run the local youth club in Sheerwater. Basically, somebody said one day, why don't you come along and play at the youth club? So they said, well, look, okay. So I think Bomber Harris couldn't make it for one reason or another. So they asked me if I'd do it about a week beforehand. I said, right, so I think Paul gave me a stack of Chuck Berry records, and so we just learned all these covers of these rock and roll standards, and just did it from there. I mean, we learned all the beginnings, and then we made up the ends, So it was a bit of a hilarious show in that respect. A lot of winking and nudging going on about when we should finish playing, making this noise, But yeah, I suppose that was the start of it, and it gave us a taste for doing more, and then we got a bit more serious and a bit more rehearsing of got a proper set together and set lists. And John, Paul's dad, was a taxi driver, so he knew all of the workingmen's clubs and CIU clubs and that sort of thing around the Surrey area, the various people that went there. So it wasn't long before he started to, put us on as the Wednesday night turn or the Thursday night turn, that sort of thing, really, to try us out. They used to keep their best acts for the weekend, obviously, So they were a bit skeptical about whether you were going to sound awful or whether, you were going to turn up at all and all that sort of stuff. And we soon sort of forged a name for ourselves of playing. People just went there for a drink. It was the beer was cheap and they weren't there to see the acts, really. They were just there because it was a social club. So they'd meet their mates and it was a good place to go because the price was right, really.
Didn't Steve and Paul get you nicked by the police?
When they were building Woking Town Centre, there was ladders and going. I mean, it was not like today where they fence it all off or anything. I think we just got drunk and started to climb ladders, and then I think we were standing on this roof of something, and Steve Brookes quite stupidly shouted out, "Look out, there's a copper," which had got the attention of the policeman. So we all tried to go down this ladder. I was the last one down, and I've just got collared. What are you doing on that roof? Don't know. Silly. But that was right cocky. That was right back in the early days when it was me, Paul, and Steve.
The thing that strikes me is you become professional really quickly. And I don't know, is that down to the three of you or John Weller being involved? But the set list, like you say, the finding gigs. I mean, one set list, there's like 47 songs on it, I think.
Yeah.
You were taking this seriously.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we absolutely loved it. I mean, it was, you soon realise when you're dumped almost into the deep end, like do a show at these workingmen's clubs, you would have a break halfway through and you do maybe 2.5 hours playing in total, and you start off with all the softer ballads and stuff at the beginning and work your way up to the more raucous stuff by the end of the night. But most people, they used to drink you better by the time, you know what I mean? It was by the time it got to sort of 11 o'clock when most of these clubs used to turn out, everybody was half cut, so you could sort of let loose a lot more then. But yeah, it was a great place to sort of learn the trade of just playing. Not necessarily songwriting or anything, but being put in front of a live audience. And most of them, like I say, weren't there to see you. Some of them were really critical. They used to, stand in front of the stage with their fingers in their ears and, make all sorts of gestures at you if they didn't like you for one reason. Wow. It didn't go quite as far as having chicken wire in front of you, but, no, not far off. But, we played most of the sort of favourites from the 50s and 60s and that sort of thing. So it went down pretty well. People used to have a dance to some of them and whatever, and we kept the volume right and we did what the venue told us to do. We turned up on time, we packed away, we went, we behaved ourselves. We became sort of quite reliable in that respect. I think our work ethic always was very good, and that was basically as me, Paul and Steve. So it wasn't the jam as you would know it. The material or the look or anything, Then there was a couple of other changes. A guy called Dave Waller was involved and we tried getting a keyboard player. And then Steve obviously left. He was the lead guitarist and main singer. When he left, because we'd been doing this for quite a while, 3 or 4 years running around the clubs, and we weren't really getting anywhere. We'd filled all these clubs and we felt that there was more to do, but we couldn't simply go around doing the clubs for the rest of our lives, being paid 25 quid,
It's quite a small circuit, Woking, isn't it? And I guess it's then the same kind of faces and at that point, so Steve Brookes leaves and you audition to replace, and the jam that we know and love is created in the sense that it's you, Bruce and Paul. Bruce turned you down first of all, didn't he?
Yeah, because Bruce was a rhythm guitarist and Paul wanted to play bass. So, and he wasn't very much into the music that we were doing. He made it quite clear that, all your stuff is all dated. It's not modern. It's not going anywhere. And I think eventually what swayed him was the fact that we had gigs and this band that he was in didn't. They weren't doing anything. They were still sort of rehearsing and that sort of thing. But it soon became clear that because Paul took on the mantle of being lead vocalist, but he couldn't play bass and sing. It just didn't really work out for him in that respect. because he was always a big fan of Paul McCartney. That's why he's called Paul. His real name's John. There was all sorts of things going on there. I mean, we couldn't have two Pauls in the band, so I became Rick because that's my middle name. Paul said to Bruce one day, well, if you want to stay in the band, you're going to have to give up rhythm guitar and take up bass. And then Paul would go back to playing rhythm guitar. I don't know whether Bruce was that particularly happy about that to start with. It was it's a bit of a transition period, but I mean, he took to it. I mean, there was an upside to this, that when Bruce plays bass, he plays it like a rhythm guitarist. So as a three-piece, it's ideal. We've got rhythm with bass, because we were always looking for a fourth member. We could never find anybody who stuck around long enough. So we started to form this core of the three-piece and trying very hard to be a four-piece band, or sound like a four-piece band with only three guys. So, and I think that helped develop the sound and the energy and the way that we sort of played and put songs together in the future. But it was all beginning, because of that particular scenario.
And at the time, this is so your first gig with as a band with the band was like 1974. But the music industry and the times are changing and the bands are changing. And I think obviously there's punk. And at which point did you stop playing those covers that you mentioned and start turning into the jam as we know it? And I'm guessing there was quite a bit of influence around the Clash and the Sex Pistols and things and Dr. Feelgood and stuff. But talk me through how that came about. Was it an overnight thing and you went, actually, we need to do something different? Or was it a gradual progression?
It was a little bit like an overnight thing because, like I say, we got fed up with doing the clubs. The people that were there weren't there to see us. They weren't into the music that we wanted to do. Paul and Steve had started with writing a couple of songs, mostly love songs and not good ones. They were okay, but they, there was no real direction to the songwriting. And it was all right. We did a few recordings and we got turned down by some of the best record companies in Britain, which was nice, But I think we started, obviously we were reading The Enemy and Sounds and those sort of papers and seeing all these other bands playing in London. That's only 30 miles away from us from Woking. So we said to John, look, we want to try and do these shows in London. They don't pay very much at all, if anything, really. These things, you were lucky if you got if you got a gig in London at the clubs and the Nashville and that sort of thing. So John wasn't particularly chuffed about it. He just thought, no, you've got a good thing going here, playing the clubs and what have you. So he wasn't particularly keen on us moving into London because it was going to cost us money, really. Mm. I mean, by that time, I was sort of out to work. Paul, I think, had some part-time things, nothing terrific, But we decided that was the way to go. If the record companies weren't going to come to us, then we would have to go to them. And they only seemed to hang around in these clubs. And I think once we got into the London, what was then the pub rock scene, we started to see other bands and we started to realise that there was an audience of our own age group that used to turn up. But we were still doing covers. We were still doing a lot of rock and roll stuff. So in a way, we sort of fitted in with that sort of Dr. Feelgood sort of thing, of energetic rock and roll as time went on. I think we then started to discover the punk thing started to emerge quite a bit. They had their own scene. They had their own clubs, whereas, we were doing more sort of mainstream sort of music venues that were sort of hang-ups from the 70s. There were bands like Bees Make Honey and all sorts of strange names, a little bit hippie, but and we made a name for ourselves in that particular circuit because it was a good, lively show, and that was that. I mean, it was obviously from there that Paul saw the Pistols, and I think he got a sort of leader about songwriting and subject matter and what have you, and I think it just gave him a few pointers and a direction, which was brilliant. I mean, it just sort of almost opened his eyes to the possibilities of what you could do with songwriting. It wasn't just the sort of traditional thing that had gone on in the early 70s. So it all started to kick off quite quickly for us at that point, And then obviously Bruce was literally just come on board at that point. And then I suppose from the moment we started doing the London clubs, that's when you would recognise us as the Jam, really. And after sort of doing about 3 years around the clubs and stuff, I think we did a sort of year and a half, 2 years on the London pub scene. And obviously, that because we were getting audiences in these places, I think it attracted the attention of the record companies to say, look, these guys are filling these places out. They're only small venues, but, it was a good indicator that people actually wanted to come and see us.
So you get signed by Polydor, Chris Parry, a single, possible album, $6,000 famously. But it's not like the money goes in your back pocket, is it? It's kind of, there's so much to pay for out of that from various things. So you presumably didn't see much of that cash, if any.
No, exactly. I mean, you hear some, bands being paid, $100,000, all this sort of thing. I mean, it's nonsense, really, because it's the record company spending it on your behalf. They'll say, well, look, we've put this, all they've done is they've budgeted for this money that they will spend this on you in the next, 6 months to a year or whatever they feel they want to do. And it's up to you to sell records for them to recoup it out of your share of the royalty.
Yeah.
So everything's weighted totally on the side of the record companies. I mean, they've been doing this for years. They know their own business. It doesn't matter whether you're given $6,000 or £600,000. It doesn't really mean very much. I mean, as soon as they saw that the records were selling and what have you, they increased the budget. I mean, it's just as simple as that.
Makes sense. Yeah, because it's all going on recordings and tour support and transport and crew and all that. And there's two things I wanted to ask you about that. So one, that first single, In the City, just sounds so different and so new and so fresh. That must have been so exciting. And then the second thing was around your work ethic as a band, because you gigged so much. It was like nuts, the amount of shows you're playing. But you had to do that to get to sound as good as you did, right?
Well, yeah, like I say, I mean, it was two things. We obviously loved doing it, and we really felt, I mean, from the moment we got signed, it became serious. It wasn't the weekend job that it was before. And if we wanted to stay there, we had to not only prove ourselves to the audience and, build a sort of fan base, but we had to prove ourselves to the record company as well that we were worth spending money on. And we had this almost ridiculous ethic that if you offered us a gig, we'd do it, irrespective of whether there was no, well, what sort of show is it, or how much money they're being paid, or anything like that. Oh, yeah, we'll do it. I mean, sometimes you do like 2 shows a day, and it was crazy stuff. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, I think the first UK tour that Polydor set up for us, I mean, it was just enormously long. It just kept getting added to. And it started to tell on us, I think, the amount of pressure and the transport. I mean, it's, you're doing ridiculous long hours during the day, and you're constantly travelling. I don't forget, we only had one suit, a stage suit, and that used to come out every night, irrespective.
Nicky Weller was saying about that, about the fact that it would kind of go home and Anne would have to wash it, which would mean that by the end of the tour it had shrunk.
Well, yeah, it was, it was just ridiculous, really. I mean, the first time we went to the States, I think we did 4 towns, 2 shows a night, 2 nights in each town. So that's 16 shows over something like about 10 days. And obviously that was starting off in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, then New York. So there's a lot of distance involved in traveling and stuff. By the time we got to New York, the shows, could have been done by the suits on their own. We didn't. And they were no fun putting them on because they were still wet from the night before, soaked in sweat and stuff. So, yeah, it was all pretty dreadful. I think that might have added to a certain, flavour of the band. You know what I mean? Look at these guys. Look at the suits they're wearing. But, there you go. It was. I mean, I've got quite fond memories of those things, even though it was no fun, really. I mean, you wouldn't do it on purpose unless you had to, But yeah, it's good days.
The other thing that comes through a lot in the conversations I've had with fans and when you watch those shows now is, and I don't know how you were doing 2 of them in a day, man, the energy and the ferociousness and the pace of the songs, and you guys were on fire. It's incredible. And you're driving that because there's, if I'm looking at you, you've got Weller on your right, Bruce on your left, is that right?
Yeah, that's what we always set up in the same way, yeah.
You're centre stage, and it feels like you're kind of the grounding of this band, but you're driving it through the rhythm, and it'd be great to understand that from a drummer point of view, but how you kept that pace up for an hour and a half for a gig. It's incredible.
Yeah, well, I suppose you'd sort of get used to it. I mean, I think it became a thing with us that we wanted to keep that energy up. It can be a bit dangerous, I mean, you think, you've played the song fast. Well, the next day you think, we'll just up it a little bit, to keep the pressure on. And also maybe the volume gets slightly more and more each time. So, your hearing starts to suffer and what have you. But because we're doing it on such a regular basis, you're up to speed, you're match fit, as they say, I don't think we really felt about that, really. That wasn't a hardship. It was, I remember you go on stage and then all of a sudden you come off stage. You just don't remember the show. It's like you live second by second through the whole thing. But you don't remember it as as you would, walk in the park or something. It's just like, yes, and you go for it, So it was a bit of a strange phenomenon in that respect, but it just really was fantastic to keep up that energy, really.
It's remarkable. And the songs, a lot of the songs are 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes. I mean, there's nothing longer than 3 minutes, really. So you're just kind of bashing through. And as soon as one song finishes, the next one starts. It's not like there's a bit of a breather and a chat with the audience or anything like that. It's bang, 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 bang. It's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, Paul was never one for sort of having conversations with the audience, really. We didn't really see a lot of point in that. I don't like it when I go and see a band and they spend 2 minutes between songs and there's one guy still trying to tune up, or they decide to have a little chat amongst themselves, or you think, no, come on, we want to see the whole show. So we did put the thing together as a show. Even, the order of the songs and how we were going to go about it and whether we were going to link the songs together, what we were going to do for an encore, because you got one whether you wanted one or not, really. So we had a lot of it sort of psyched out in their mind about how we were going to go about this. And I think it just kept that whole thing. It was exciting for the people to watch, hopefully, that, we weren't going to be, boring or anything like that. So there's all sorts of reasons why we did it.
So as the band becomes bigger, you're selling out bigger arenas, you're having hit singles and introducing more and more songs into that repertoire. Was there any point where it became less fun? Because you were constantly either touring, writing or recording. And I think there's an element where, your work ethic is incredible. And I think there's a danger in retrospect where a lot of people talk about Paul and the Jam, and it wasn't. It was a band. It was the three of you. And you and Bruce worked so hard on the sound for the backing tracks. You're doing all-nighters together. But was there an element where any of that became less than fun?
Not really. I mean, it moved on a pace. I mean, we soon came out of the London clubs to the smaller venues, going on tour, being signed, moving up to bigger venues, being paid a little bit more money. We could afford better hotels, better transport. Then you start doing other things, other territories. You're going to Europe and Japan and the odd foray into America and stuff like that. So it just kept moving, So it didn't really become boring. We were still doing what we did the most. The scenery changed, but we were still doing the same thing. We were still sort of plowing ahead with what we enjoyed doing. So it didn't really become boring. I think it got to the point where it was obvious that we had no direction. We weren't being managed by John so much. We were being managed by the record company and by the agent. If they said, look, we've got this contract with this amount of records that are coming out. You've got so many singles and one album in the next time period. And so they would set the agenda of when we had to record, release, and so therefore where we had to tour. They would know where the records were selling and where we needed to go, what other territories, don't forget the UK and all this sort of stuff. So the record companies pretty much managed the band, and of course they wanted pound of flesh. And if they said, right, you're now off to Europe and you do a tour around Europe and you come back and you record another single, and then you've got to go and do record an album or whatever and release that and promote it, and then you've got to go to the States or Japan. We just did it. The record company dictated nearly all of that. And so, the agent would then organise the hotels and the transport and the tour managers and the crew, and the record company would take care of the financing and what have you. I mean, when we first signed, the record company said, look, this is the publisher you can use. We recommend him. He's a good guy. This is the agent you should use. These are the solicitors that you should use. Because we knew nothing. None of us, John included, how to run a band professionally. I mean, John was great in the early days. He drove us around from workingmen's clubs to workingmen's clubs and made sure we got our 25 quid. But I mean, as soon as you step into the professional world, and especially in the way that the band suddenly took off and it became sort of global, if you like, completely inexperienced, all of us. I mean, so it was great that we had a record company that was behind us. But on the other hand, their agenda was slightly different from ours. They wanted to sell units, and that was their prime goal. It's a business, that's what they do. So we sort of trucked alongside each other for a while. There were occasions when they would say, right, we want another single. And you think, well, Paul didn't like writing to order. He never did. Not many people do. So it was nice to sort of throw back and say, well, I'll tell you what, we'll do what we do really well. We'll do a cover version, which is easy. So we'll do David Watts. as a single, for instance, and put that out as a single, which was nice because it was a great song. It was not a particularly well-known Kinks number. A lot of people still think that, the Jam wrote that, but, we didn't. But it was nice to sort of have that experience to draw up on when we were under pressure for releases and that sort of thing. But it was generally a thoroughly enjoyable thing. But I think the point that we weren't being sort of managed properly, that we didn't have anybody to turn around and say, okay, now look, we've established ourselves, we can call the shots now about how much workload we take on, where we go, and what releases we do. That I think that pressure started to really sort of build, and I think Paul started to feel that more than say me and Bruce did. Although we all felt it, I think Paul just reacted to it a lot more badly than myself and Bruce did, which I think really just led to, I suppose you could say, Paul burnt out. Really, I mean, but then nobody actually said, right, okay, stop. Let's take 6 months out. Let's just, take control and get our own career back online. And so really, I think the only way that Paul could see of getting out was to sort of break the band up, and that's the most logical thing in his mind that he felt he could do. And despite everything, from us and John and the record company saying, you really should think about this, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, it just didn't come up on his radar at all. So, which was unfortunate. But on the other hand, there's 5 years of very intense work, and we did a lot. All of us, we all worked really, really hard, and we achieved a great deal, which is great to look back on.
Yeah, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? You're looking at the time, the pressures of the label, that treadmill, writing songs to order that you mentioned, and maybe you're right. Maybe now you're kind of feeling that could you all have done, or any of you have done more to break that cycle? But at the time when you're in it, that's an impossible situation, because you just want to drive the band forward. You want to be a success. You've got the pressures of the fans and the record labels and everybody. But when that split came, that must have been devastating for you, for Bruce, for John Weller. I know that Nicky was talking, and Anne chipped in actually saying that when Paul had told them the air was blue, and for the fans, everybody was devastated about that, weren't they? Well, yeah, it was just the most, what could possibly go wrong? You know what I mean? At that point, you're selling records, you're touring well, the shows are great, everything you do is working out really fantastically. There just seemed no reason for it at all. And I think one of the things that myself and Bruce really noticed was when we were sort of taken aside by Paul and John in the summer of '82, and Paul had decided to tell us that he wanted to leave the band, the reasons that he gave us were totally different from the reasons that came out in the press in the early '83. So that sort of made us think, well, hang on a minute, why did you really do this? It just seemed like ridiculous. It was a very strange time, that the last 6 months of the band, because we had commitments to do tours, and we released the live album as the last one to sort of get us out of the record contract with Polydor, and we just quite in a very gentlemanly fashion fulfilled all of our commitments, went out and did the shows, which to my memory were really good. We still put plenty into it. We didn't sort of get down in the mouth about it. I always thought that Paul would change his mind. Bruce wanted to leave the band there and then. He wanted to leave in the summer. He said, well, look, bollocks, I'm off. And we had to sort of persuade him not to do that, because Paul could always change his mind and just stick with it, It was a very sort of strange time, really, for us, because, like you say, all the work that had been put into it by myself, Bruce, and Paul, and all the people around us, the record company, the agents, and, to build something like that and have that success, and which is rare, really. A lot of bands don't necessarily survive very long, but to sort of cut it short early seems a bit strange. It's remarkable to me of how you agreed to finish things off properly with that one final tour, because how much of that was contractual obligation did you feel? How much was it commitment to the fans? Because there must have been a bit of you that wanted to do what Bruce was saying and just kind of go, do you know what, that's it, that's done, we can't come back for this. Well, I didn't feel like that. I felt, I'm gonna see this out, because we were having such a great time,
it just seemed like crazy to us that, what are you going to do? I mean, the jam for me, in any case, was the reason for getting out of bed for 10 years. And all of a sudden, it was suddenly not there, which was a bit of a strange, it's worse than being made redundant. You're suddenly, you don't have a purpose in life, and which you've put your heart and soul into it, because everything, girlfriends, holidays, jobs, whatever, all came second to the band. We did literally, all of us had that ethic. So it was a bit strange to find that was being, it was a bit like a sort of kick in the teeth, especially because we weren't even consulted about it. It was just, right, that's what's going to happen. And you think, well, just a minute. You know what I mean?
It's like your partner just decided, like you wake up one morning, your partner decides they don't want to be with you anymore and they move out that same day almost, isn't it? And there's nothing you can do with it about it. It's completely out of your control.
Exactly. You simply have to deal with it, and that's that.
So many of the fans have said to me that tour was the best. You did 5 nights at Wembley, and I know that you could have added more. That could have kept coming and coming and coming. But so many of the fans have said that's the best tour that you ever did. What do you remember about that final night? I don't know. Was there any element of you that was ticking off the set list, or saving the set list, or deciding to do something different on the songs, or give it one last big shot or something? Well,
one of the things that did, because obviously you go through the set list each night and every night, and we had done that all, since its inception. And on the last show, I remember thinking, well, that's the last time we'll ever play that song. And that thought came every single time we finished the song, and I'd look down to see what was next, and and again, you think, oh, this is the last time we're doing this. So that was really what sort of prompted me in later years to revisit the jam songs and form the Gift and go and do that, which was a lovely experience to actually do. But yeah, it was a very odd thing, those last shows, because it's difficult to explain the emotion of it, but I could see it in the faces of the people in the front row, and I knew that they probably felt the same way that I did. And I bet you, Bruce and Paul, felt the same way as well. These people had supported us and come to the shows and bought the records, and they're into the same thing that we were. And, we belonged to them, and, vice versa. So it was a bit of a teary experience, really. It was a bit strange, all of a sudden to come to a sort of a stop like that for no justifiable reason. None of us had died. It wasn't like we weren't selling records or selling tours or, all the sort of usual things that you see when bands come to a demise. So it was quite novel in that respect.
And there is one thing when you look now at the legacy that the Jam have left and what exists in people's minds and hearts, that is so different from the bands of that time that are still playing, that are still together. There's an element where I wonder if anybody, you kind of look at it and go, do you know what, that stands up as a decision. We didn't agree with it at the time, but look at it now. When you look at the songs as a drummer, were there particular songs that you were like really proud of and really love playing? Because for me, I'm thinking some of the stuff like All Around the World, that amazing opening, Funeral Pyre, which is a nut song generally, but that's that kind of snare drum, the fierce finale of Tube Station. Were there any of those songs where you hear them on the radio now, or at the time when you were playing, we were like, actually, this is a drummer's song?
I don't know. I think we're all immensely proud of all the bits and pieces that we did. We put in. I think it's back to this thing again. This is a 3-piece band trying to sound like a 4-piece. So we put all sorts of stuff in that we didn't want to rest on our laurels under any of it. From my point of view, which is an odd thing really, is that I used to think to myself, "Crikey, am I going to remember all these songs, one song to the next?" So I used to put in like a signature thing to say, in the drumming, to say, right, well, this is how I remember it because this bit's in the song, which obviously led to the whole rhythm section being memorable for that particular song. Pretty Green, of course, you know the rhythm of that, it's no problem. Remember the whole song because of that. Funeral Pyre, easy. You remember the rhythm pattern for that, easy. Remember the song. So it was a little spark of, well, let's put something different in each particular song. Don't sound like AC/DC or those bands where they just plod through the songs and the drumming's exactly the same on every album. So there was that little thing from me. But I think Bruce was the same. He, like I say, he played like a rhythm guitarist. So there wasn't just the bass foundation, but there was rhythm and melody as well there. So and it just seemed to create that sound, which eventually became the Jam. And it was, I think that meant that each and every song had its own input, really. I mean, we didn't want to become boring. I suppose looking back on it, it's easy to say that you could see the progression of the band, the roughness from, the sort of raw energy of In the City to, getting more and more slick or studio savvy by the time, sound effects comes out or something like that, So, we were trying to be intelligent about it, I think, and moving on and evolving. What can you do with a three-piece band, not that you haven't done before, So
I'm aware of time, so I'm going to get to some of the fans' questions, but there's an element for me where the combination of the three of you, those lyrics which are just some of the best poetry that's ever been written, the bass lines from Bruce just stand out. As soon as you hear those on the radio or on, what the song is, and you love every second. But the rhythm and the driving the song forward from you as well. It was the three of you that made that band. And so I'm going to give you a couple of questions from the fans, if that's all right.
Hello there, Rick. It's the Magic Mod. What was it like being in the best band in the fucking world?
Thank you, Ben, otherwise known as the Magic Mod. Love it. Similar question, actually, from Twitter, @LongLiveTheJam. What would you say was the Jam's legacy?
It's a difficult one when you're standing in the middle of it. Because our perspective on it was different from obviously everybody else's. But I think I like the idea that we did move on. We didn't become boring, and that we did sort of, and I suppose in a lot of the ways that a lot of the songs still, have lasted the test of time. That you could, especially the later ones, they still stand up quite well as songs. Lyrically as well as musically. Yeah. So that's always a nice thing to look back on. There's nothing too embarrassing about some of them, I don't know. It's difficult to answer from an insider's point of view, because we just got on with what we did and enjoyed what we did, so we were so wrapped up in the creative side of it and the actual performance side of it that we didn't sort of look back too much at that time. We were all constantly looking forward and how can we reinvent ourselves all the time?
There's another one from Trevor Neal. Trevor's recorded a little message for us, which I'll play.
Hello, Rick. It's Trevor here from Trevor and Simon. We met years ago, actually. It's been a while since we last caught up. It was probably about 40 odd years ago, 1979. I saw you in Debenhams when you were on tour with the Setting Suns show. You were standing under the escalator with Bruce while Paul was doing some shopping. I got your autographs. I'm sure you remember that. And you'll definitely remember in the evening, because I came to see the show and went backstage after, got your autographs again. I was the 16-year-old mod lad wearing a parka. Yeah, anyway, it's been a while, but obviously we won't be able to meet in Debenhams again now they've gone into administration. But if you're ever in Asda in Broadstairs, let me know. We could catch up. Anyway, about the question, you're obviously an amazing drummer. You're always very comfortable behind the kit and you make everything look quite easy. I play in a covers band, and when we play Tube Station, sometimes our drummer needs resuscitating afterwards. Admittedly, we do extend the drum solo a bit for about half an hour or so, but it's obviously a difficult song to play. So I wondered, in the Jam set list, were there any songs that gave you the jitters a bit or a sense of dread when you saw they were coming up from a drumming perspective? I mean, I'm sure there wasn't, because you obviously cope with them, but I just wondered if there was the odd song that you had your doubts about. That's all. Anyway, nice talking to you. Cheers. All the best. Bye.
No, not really. That sounds like an easy answer to that, but I mean, like any, especially drummers, I suppose, once you've got 2 or 3 songs under your belt in a set, you start to warm up. The more energetic and tracks that you need to play are easily tackled. The most difficult, I mean, if you started the set off with Funeral Pie, it'd be a complete mess. Because, you know what I mean? I'm not really warmed up enough. So it's nice to put that nearer the end, And of course, the other thing that I really didn't like was the fact that just as you're really, running at top temperature, the show's over. Yeah. You think you could, I want to do another half an hour, do you know what I mean, or something. But as individual songs, no, we were so, like I say, we were so well rehearsed and so well played most of the time. It wasn't really an issue. It wasn't very good to take a month off and do absolutely nothing, because then it was hard work to get back up to what you remember it being. Practice again,
Love it. Stephen Williams says, ask him about the lion. I don't know what that means.
We used to borrow vans. We never had a van in the early days. So anybody who had a van, we used to borrow it off them, almost steal it. And there was one guy who owned a small lioness. And he used to bring it along to the Michael's Club where we used to play on a Friday night late. You know, it used to go on to the early hours. And it was like the size of a small dog when we first saw it. But obviously these things, they grow, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And he couldn't keep it in the house anymore. He was tearing up the furniture. You know, when it stood up, it was about 6-7 feet tall. You know, I mean, it was enormous. So he bought this Luton van, and he kept it in the back. You know, those big sort of box vans with a shutter back to them. And, of course, we borrowed his van. But if we borrowed the van, we had to take the lion with us to the shows, you know. People don't believe you, right? But it's absolutely true. And this lioness was, I mean, it was as tame as anything, you know. I mean, it was just big, and it was quite frightening. I mean, on one particular occasion, some guy said, "Oh, we'll give you a hand, move the equipment out of the club in Farnborough, in a place called the Tumbledown Dick." And so we got the equipment out, and we said to him, "Now, look, we're going to open up the back and we're going to put the equipment in, and then we're going to shut the door again because there's a cat in here and we don't want it to get out." So they go, "Okay, righto." But when they saw the lioness, they didn't realise, when you say cat, you know, it's I don't know what they were thinking, but it wasn't this sort of huge monster of a thing, you know, just sitting there chewing on a dead rabbit or something, you know. So there were problems. But I mean, eventually it just became an issue for the owner, and it got, I think they had to put it into one of the safari parks or something, because it decked somebody in Woking Town Centre. You know, you used to take it for walks on a lead and this sort of thing. But yeah, I don't know whether you'd be allowed to do that these days. But it's a sort of nice memory of you know, one of the odd things that happened.
Love it. Right. Another one from Chombury FC on Twitter. I don't know if you remember doing the Jam fan club Q&As, but there was one bit in there from you where they asked you what your favourite single and LP was, and you said, "Don't know." And your hobbies were indoor games, your likes were indoor games, and your dislikes were outdoor games. Is that still the case?
I don't know. I mean, I used to hate doing them things because I could never really think of an answer. I thought I'd just say any old shit, really. Yeah, probably. I'm not, you know, I'm not keen on football. I don't play football or anything like that. I mean, I'm a good backgammon player, so... Still stacks up.
John Clapham, how many fags a day did you smoke in the Jam days? You always seem to have one on the go in photos.
I know, I could have smoked for England. 20 a day, not many more than that. And I smoked for 35 years. I don't smoke anymore. But, yeah, it was just one of those things. Somebody pointed it out to me one day that every single photograph of the Jam, one of us is smoking. I mean, Bruce didn't smoke, I don't think, but yeah. Not a great advert for the health industry.
No, exactly, yeah. A couple of last ones. Baz, is there a modern band that you'd like to drum for?
I don't know. I think that changes all the time. I don't know. I mean, I remember one band that really struck me when I first heard them, and this was a while ago now, was Muse, because I hadn't heard an individual guitarist like that guy for a long time. You know, because they were three-piece as well. I mean, I think that they had a really unusual sound, which was something new and something different. But that must have been, when did they first emerge? During the 90s, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's nice to see something a bit different and get involved in that sort of thing. I don't know. It's difficult because, you know, growing up with a band, you sort of grow into it. And it's sort of to sort of slot into somebody else's group is, I think, would probably be, you know, I've done it a couple of times, and it's a little bit different. You know, it's like sort of joining the club when the club's been going for 50 years, you know, and you're still the new member, you know. So
last one from Neil G, which is not really a question, but he said he'd be grateful I could pass on a personal thanks for me for being a part of the best band in the world, the Jam of my life, and it was all three members together that made it the complete package. And I've had so many comments like this from everybody saying about how much the Jam means to them. The fans were such an important, and still are such an important part of the success of the band and the legacy, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the whole cultural thing, you know. People used to come to shows, they used to travel to go to other shows, they'd meet people, you know, faces that they knew, that they, you know, made friends. Some people met their future wives and husbands, and, you know, so it was very much a community thing, which was absolutely fabulous. I mean, we used to talk to the fans after the show and that sort of thing, so the yeah, it was a lovely sort of, I suppose it was like a sort of community really of like-minded people. And, we didn't shut ourselves off. We didn't, not like a lot of people do these days. There was no us and them, and I think we appreciated very much in those days, the people who kept us in work, if you like, doing what we loved doing, were the people who came to the shows and bought the records. So, and it was nice to talk to them. They appreciated everything, in the same way that we appreciated what they were about. So, yeah, it was definitely a two-way street. And it is nice to think that, people look back on those days in the same sort of fondness that I do as well. And I'm sure Bruce and Paul does also,
Yeah. Rick, this has been so lovely. I have two final questions for you, which are the standard questions on this podcast. Two final questions for you. You're allowed one song for the rest of your life. It can be anything from the Jam. You could pick Style Council or Paul Weller solo, but my gut is it'll be the Jam. Which one are you going to go with?
Well, it'd have to be, there's no way off. Let's not go there. Yeah, I mean, if it was a Jam song, I don't know. I mean, I like every single one of them. I think any one of the Jam songs could have been a single, which I think is nice to think about. There's some gems on some albums that things like Light from a Window, I think, was a fabulous song. A lot of the stuff on Modern World album got passed over a bit too quickly, maybe. I mean, I'm particularly proud of things like, Riverbank or Absolute Beginners, maybe. I don't know. I mean, how long you got? I mean, I could probably run through the whole lot, really.
Which one would you put on straight after this podcast? If you were going to play one song straight after this, which one would it be? Or you were going to drum on? If you were going to have a little drum around, which would it be?
Let's do Absolute Beginners then. I think that's a good one to do.
I'll let you have this. Now, I appreciate this question is probably going to be a tough one as well, but the idea of this podcast also is to be able to chat with Paul at the end of the series as well. Is there anything that you think I should ask him? Is there anything you'd like from a Rick Buckler point of view me to cover off?
No, not really. He's obviously sort of, taking his own decisions, and that's fine. I think everybody's happy with that, really. So, yeah, I mean, I'll just ask him if he wants to come down the pub sometime. I don't think he doesn't drink anymore, though, does he? I'll buy him an orange juice,
I didn't ask you about the booze, actually, because the riders you guys had were pretty interesting, to say the least. What was yours? 2 bottles of red wine, wasn't it?
Yeah, Bull's Blood. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
What was Bruce and Paul's?
Bruce was 2 bottles of Bacardi, and Paul was 2 bottles of vodka.
And talking to Dennis Monday, they sound, I mean, some of those tours sound pretty messy, to say the least.
Well, yeah, they could be. I mean, drinking became our sort of hobby because it was the easiest thing to do. So we always met in the bar in a hotel, if that was, order of the day, and to let off steam. We probably drank far too much. People used to warn, don't go out with those guys. You know what I mean? You'll regret it. Most of the time, I think they did. I don't think they were up to our sort of standards, really, in that respect.
Who was the worst? Who was the one you had to keep up with, or you had to try not to keep up with, I should say?
Well, I didn't used to drink during the day at all because I can't play if I'm drunk.
Yeah.
Paul used to drink all day, right from the early hours. Bruce used to start at midday. I mean, another fond memory was crates of beer left over from the rider from the night before being loaded onto the bus in the morning as we'd leave. And you get to about 10, 11 o'clock in the morning and you hear as the bottles start to open, So that became a bit of a mess, really. You can't keep that sort of stuff going for long. I mean, Paul was often physically sick before a show because he drank too much or whatever. So it's not good. It's not good,
This has been such a blast. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, man.
No, thanks very much. It's been good. Okay, cheers. All right.
Wow. My thanks once again to Rick for giving up some time to chat on the podcast. You can find out more about Rick's story in the brilliant book, That's Entertainment, My Life in the Jam, which was created with another one of my podcast guests, Snowy, and my thanks to him for sorting out that chat with Rick as well. Really appreciate it. I cannot quite believe Rick Buckler has been on the Paul Weller Fan Podcast. Amazing. Next up on the podcast, my guest is Daniel Rachel, musician turned award-winning author. Not only did he write the brilliant Isle of Noises, Conversation with Great British Songwriters, which was a Guardian and NME Book of the Year, but more recently, Walls Come Tumbling Down, the music and politics of rock against racism, Two-Tone and Red Wedge, of which Mr. Weller played a key part, and Don't Look Back in Anger, The Rise and Fall of Cool Britannia. I cannot recommend these two amazing books enough, and we'll hear all about them and the links with Mr. Paul Weller on the next podcast. Don't forget, make sure you share this episode on social media. If you're part of a Jam forum on Facebook, then plug the heck out of it, please. It's a busy old place, so the more you can do to help us to shout about this podcast, the more it helps us to find new listeners to the show, and the more it helps us, I say us, me, basically, to achieve that end goal. You can find me on Twitter at WellerFanPod, or on Instagram and Facebook, it's Paul Weller Fan Podcast. I'll see you next time.